The night I met the man I would marry, I had only $3 and a few coins in my pocket. His name was Arthur Finch. When he asked me to be his wife, it was not with big, fancy words. He just looked at me with his kind eyes and said, "We are both lonely people. Maybe we can be lonely together. Maybe we can keep each other warm." My name is Clara Mayhew. I am 26 years old. Before this winter, my life was small and cold. I lived in a tiny room at the top of an old building. The room was an attic, right above a small coffee shop called the Salty Mug. The coffee shop was not very good. The coffee always tasted a little burnt. The air always smelled like wet sand and old coffee grounds. My attic room was not much better. It had one small window in the ceiling, a skylight. Every time it rained, water would drip, drip, drip onto the floor. I had a small bucket to catch the water. At night, I slept under a pile of old blankets. They were from a second-hand store and smelled like old closets and mothballs. I was always cold. In my small refrigerator, there was almost nothing. Sometimes I had a little bit of oat milk. Right now, there was one apple, old and soft with brown spots. To make money, I painted pictures. I did not think my pictures were very good. I painted what tourists wanted to buy. I painted pictures of seagulls on the beach for $10. I painted pictures of the lighthouse when the sun went down for $20. My hands were always cold from the attic air, but my heart felt even colder. This story is about the worst winter of my life. It is also about the best winter of my life. It all started on a very cold, very gray day. The Salty Mug coffee shop closed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. My job was to clean up. I wiped down all the sticky tables. I swept the sandy floor. The owner, a grumpy man named Sal, gave me my pay for the day. It was just $11 in tips. I put the crumpled bills in my pocket. I felt the $3 that were already there. $14, not enough. It was never enough. I said goodbye to Sal, but he just grunted and did not look up from his newspaper. I climbed the rickety wooden stairs at the back of the building. The stairs were outside and the cold wind blew hard against me. Each step groaned under my feet. I finally reached the door to my attic. Inside, it was dark and cold. I flipped the light switch. The single light bulb hanging from a wire flickered weakly. It looked like it was tired of trying, just like me. I leaned my newest painting against the wall. It was a picture of a golden retriever dog. The person who ordered it wanted the dog to be wearing a little blue sailor hat. They promised to pay $40 for it. $40 was a lot of money for me. It could pay for food for a week, but I hated the painting. It felt silly and fake. I hated that I had to paint things I did not like just to survive. I picked up my paintbrush. The bristles were stiff with old paint. I sat on my hard wooden stool and started to work on the dog's silly hat. Outside, I could hear the sound of the ocean waves. They crashed against the old wooden pier, over and over. The sound was loud and angry. I wondered if the pier would just give up one day. I wondered if it would break apart and float away into the gray water. Sometimes I felt like that pier, holding on but getting weaker every day. Later that night, the rain started. It was a hard, cold rain. The drip, drip, drip from my skylight got faster. I looked at the bucket on the floor. It was almost full. I was too tired to go empty it. I sat on my mattress on the floor and pulled the mothball-smelling blanket around me. The cold went right through it. I felt a deep sadness, a feeling that everything was empty and had no meaning. When I felt this way, I always did the same thing. I took out my sketchbook and a pencil. I did not draw seagulls or lighthouses. I drew what my heart felt like. I drew a very small rowboat. It was alone in a big, dark ocean. There were no stars in the sky. There were no oars in the boat. It was just drifting, lost and helpless. I finished the drawing and looked at it. It was a sad little picture. I carefully tore the page out of my sketchbook. On the wall next to my mattress, there were other drawings just like it. 12 little boats, all drifting, all alone. I taped the new one to the wall with the others. It was a collection of my lonely days. My phone, which was plugged into the only working outlet, buzzed on the floor. The screen lit up the dark room. It was a message from the power company. It was another notice. It said my bill was past due. It said they would turn off my service. I almost laughed. They could not turn off my electricity because I had not had any for 3 weeks. I could not pay the bill, so they had already cut it off. The phone was only working because I charged it at the coffee shop. I pressed the button and the screen went dark. I crawled under the thin, scratchy blanket. I pulled it up to my chin. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. I felt something wet on my face. At first, I thought it was the leak from the ceiling. I told myself it was just the rain, just more drips. But it was not the rain. It was my own tears, silent and warm on my cold cheeks. The next day, the sky was gray and heavy with fog. The air was damp and cold. I packed up 6 of my small paintings. They were mostly sunsets and seagulls. I put them carefully into a cloth bag. I carried the heavy bag down the stairs and walked toward the boardwalk. There was a craft fair every weekend, even in the winter. It was a small chance to make some money. The boardwalk was quiet and empty. The thick fog made it hard to see far. The few people walking around looked like ghosts. They held paper cups of coffee and walked quickly, their shoulders hunched against the cold. The sound of the waves was muffled by the fog. I found an empty space and set up my small, wobbly table. I arranged my paintings on it. The bright colors of the sunsets looked strange in the gray light. For hours I stood there, my feet growing numb from the cold concrete. My fingers felt like ice. A woman stopped and looked at my paintings. She had a kind face. She pointed to a small painting of a wave. "I like the color," she said. "It's a very pretty blue. I will buy it for the color, not for the picture." She gave me $15. I thanked her, but her words made me feel small. By 3 o'clock, almost everyone was gone. The fog was even thicker now. It felt like a wet, cold blanket covering the world. All the smart people were home, warm inside. I knew I would not sell anything else. I started to pack my paintings back into my bag. I felt the familiar weight of disappointment in my chest. That was when I saw him. He was walking slowly through the fog, looking at the few booths that were still open. He was tall, and his hair was gray and messy from the wind. He wore a dark blue peacoat that looked very old but very warm. He stopped at my table. I felt my heart beat a little faster. He was not looking at my paintings for sale. His eyes were on the small sketch I had pinned to the side of my table for decoration. It was the little rowboat with no oars. "That one is not for sale," I said. My voice sounded sharp and nervous. He looked up from the drawing and smiled at me. It was a gentle smile. It made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "I was not going to ask to buy it," he said. His voice was calm and quiet. I was just wondering, why are there no oars in the boat? I was surprised by his question. No one had ever asked about the drawings before. I looked at the little boat. Because it's honest, I said. It shows how things really feel sometimes. He nodded slowly, still looking at the drawing. He seemed to understand. He reached into the pocket of his pea coat and pulled out a small, simple card. It had some flour smudged on the corner. It said, Arthur Finch, retired gardener. Below his name was a phone number. I live in the old lighthouse keeper's cottage, he said, holding the card out to me. It's an old house. I need some help to get it ready for the winter. There are many small jobs to do. I cannot pay you a lot of money, but I can feed you. I can give you real meals. Not cheap food like the fries they sell on the boardwalk. Good hot food. He paused. Think about it. I almost laughed out loud. It was not a happy laugh. It was a sharp, bitter sound like a seagull's cry. I did not trust people who offered help. Help always wanted something in return. But then I thought about my cold attic. I thought about the eviction notice my landlord had taped to my door yesterday. I had until the end of the week to leave. I reached into my pocket and my cold fingers touched the 3 crumpled dollar bills. What choice did I have? What kind of hours? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He told me the hours were flexible. I could come in the mornings and work until the afternoon. I took the flour-smudged card from his hand. His fingers were warm. I nodded, but in my heart, I did not believe him. It sounded too good to be true. People were not just kind for no reason. The next morning, I walked to the address on the card. The cottage was at the very end of Shell Road. The paved road ended and it turned into a gravel path. The cottage was small and white, and it stood strong against the gray sky. It looked like it had been there for 100 years. On the porch, strings of scallop shells hung and clinked together in the wind. They made a soft, musical sound. I knocked on the heavy wooden door. After a moment, Arthur opened it. He smiled his gentle smile. "You came," he said. The inside of the cottage was warm. It smelled wonderful, like cedar wood and dried flowers. It was the smell of a real home. Arthur led me into the kitchen. He handed me a big, heavy mug. It was filled with hot tea. It was not tea from a bag. I could see the loose tea leaves floating in the hot water. It smelled like spices and chamomile. He pointed to the big wooden kitchen table. "There are some rules," he said, his voice serious but not unkind. "Rule 1, if you work, you eat. Rule 2, if you do not work, you do not eat. Rule 3, if you need to stay the night, the guest room is at the end of the hall. The door has a lock on the inside. You can lock it. I am too old and too tired to be a creepy old man." I felt the corner of my mouth twitch. It was almost a smile. "You said you are not paying much," I reminded him. "That is correct," he said, nodding. "I am not. But you will be warm here, and the pantry is full of food." My first job was to clean the windows. They were covered in a thin white film of salt from the ocean air. It made the world outside look blurry and gray. I scrubbed and scrubbed each window pane. There were 12 windows in the small cottage. My arms started to ache. My shoulders burned. While I worked, Arthur was outside on the porch. He was sanding the old wooden railing. I could hear him humming old songs about the sea. The sound was low and steady. When I finished the last window, I stepped back to look at my work. The glass was so clean it was almost invisible. I could see the world outside clearly for the first time. I could see the gray ocean and the tall, tough grasses on the dunes. The world still looked cold, but it was beautiful. For lunch, Arthur brought out 2 bowls of tomato soup. He had made it himself from scratch. It was thick and hot. He also had a loaf of crusty bread from a bakery. It was still a little warm. I was so hungry. I ate my bowl of soup very fast. He quietly filled my bowl a second time. I ate that one too. We did not talk while we ate. I was too busy enjoying the food. It was the best soup I had ever tasted. That night, I walked back to my attic. As soon as I opened the door, the cold hit me. The room was dark and damp. The bucket of water had overflowed. There was a puddle on the floor. I looked at the bare walls and the single mattress. I thought about the warm, clean cottage. I thought about the smell of cedar and the taste of the hot soup. I could not stay here another night. I took out my phone. My fingers were shaking, partly from the cold and partly from being nervous. I typed a short message to Arthur. "Can I stay tomorrow night?" I sent it. A minute later, my phone buzzed. He had replied, "Guest bed is made. Bring the rowboat sketch if you want. I like it." We started a routine. It was as easy and natural as breathing. We did not have to talk about it. It just happened. In the mornings, I worked on the outside of the cottage. Arthur gave me a bucket of battleship gray paint and a brush. I painted all the window frames. The fresh paint made the old cottage look clean and strong. While I painted, Arthur worked in his garden. He had a large hedge of rosemary bushes. The winter wind had been hard on them. He carefully tied up the branches and trimmed away the dead parts. He worked slowly and with great care, like he was taking care of an old friend. In the afternoons, we moved inside. The weather was getting colder. I would sit at the big kitchen table. The house was always warm from the wood stove in the corner. Arthur bought small wooden plaques from the craft store. My job was to paint them. He asked me to paint cheerful things. I painted small lighthouses with bright lights. I painted blue herons standing in the water. I painted smiling whales. I found that I enjoyed painting these simple, happy things. It felt different from painting what tourists wanted. While I painted, Arthur would do his own work in the kitchen. He would sit at the other end of the table and shell peas into a big metal bowl. The sound of the peas hitting the bowl was a soft, steady rhythm. Or he would knead dough for bread. His hands, covered in flour, would push and fold the dough with a slow strength. Sometimes we talked. He would ask me a simple question like, "Do you prefer the color blue or the color green?" I would answer, and then maybe I would ask him something like, "Did you plant this garden yourself?" But mostly, we worked in silence. It was not an awkward silence. It was a comfortable silence. I learned that silence was his way of communicating. It was a quiet peace we shared in the warm room. One evening, after dinner, I found a box of colored chalk on the kitchen counter. I looked at him with a questioning expression. He just nodded toward the hallway that led to the guest room. "The floorboards in that hall are very old," he said. "They creak and groan. When you walk, mark the spots that are quiet, the spots that do not make a sound. It can be a map of the quiet places." It felt like a strange game. That night, when I walked to my room, I stepped very carefully. When my foot landed on a board that did not make a sound, I bent down and drew a tiny blue star on it. The next morning, when I walked out of my room, I saw that something new had been added. Next to about half of my blue stars, there was a small, bright yellow moon. He had walked the hall too. He had found the quiet spots with me. I smiled, then I laughed. It was a real laugh, a happy sound that filled the kitchen. I could not remember the last time I had laughed like that. Every day, he paid me. He never handed the money to me directly. He would leave a small, plain envelope under my dinner plate. Inside, there was always $30 in cash. It was not a lot, but it was enough. It was enough to start paying back my electricity bill. It was enough to feel like I was earning my place. I never asked him why he needed so much help with his small cottage. He seemed strong enough to do most of it himself. And he never asked me why I needed the work so badly. He never asked about my life before I came to his door. We just accepted each other's presence. We understood that we both had our own quiet histories. Snow came early that year. It was not a big, heavy snow. It was a thin, wet snow that fell silently from the gray sky. It covered the rosemary hedge like a dusting of sugar. As the days got colder and darker, Arthur grew quieter. I noticed his shoulders were often tight, like he was carrying a heavy weight. One morning, I found him standing in the garden. He was just staring at a patch of dormant lavender plants. They were brown and looked dead. He did not seem to know I was there. My wife, Eleanor, she used to make shortbread cookies with these, he said. His voice was rough, like gravel. She loved the smell of lavender. He paused and looked at the ground. Before the cancer took her. I did not know what to say. Words felt useless and small. So I did not say anything. I knelt down on the cold, damp ground beside the lavender patch and started to pull the small weeds that grew there. My fingers were cold, but I kept working. After a minute of silence, he knelt down beside me and started to pull weeds too. We worked together side by side, not speaking. That night, after he had gone to bed, I could not sleep. I went to the kitchen and sat at the big table. I got out my sketchbook and a small set of watercolors. I thought about Arthur and his wife. I thought about his sadness. I started to paint a picture for him. I painted a small rowboat like my others. But this time, I painted it with one oar, just one. It was not enough to steer properly, but it was a start. It was a little bit of hope. I left the small painting on the kitchen table, leaning against the sugar bowl where he would see it when he came down for his morning tea. The next morning, I woke up early. I came out to the kitchen, and he was already there, sitting at the table. He was holding the painting in his hands. He was looking at it so intently, so still, that for a second I thought he had fallen asleep sitting up. I held my breath. Finally, he looked up at me. His eyes were shiny. "Thank you, Clara," he whispered. That was all he said. But in that moment, I felt something shift inside my chest. It was like furniture moving in a room I had thought was empty for a long, long time. A space was being made for something new. A big storm came from the northeast. It hit our part of the coast with incredible force. The wind howled outside. It sounded like a big, wounded animal crying in the dark. The power lines in the town snapped, and the whole world went black. The windows of the little cottage shook and rattled. I was afraid they would break. We lit candles and oil lamps. We huddled by the big wood stove in the living room. Arthur piled more logs into it until it glowed red and hot. He brought out 2 thick, heavy quilts that his mother had made 50 years ago. We wrapped ourselves in them and listened to the storm. The rain was not falling down. It was being driven sideways by the wind. It hit the house in sheets. The ocean, usually a calming presence, had disappeared into a roaring gray noise. We could not work. We could not read. There was nothing to do but sit and talk. The storm seemed to strip away our usual silence. Our conversation, usually so careful and spare, became raw and real. He looked at the painting of the rowboat with one oar, which he had placed on the mantelpiece above the stove. "Why were there no oars in your other drawings?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried over the sound of the wind. I looked at the fire. The flames danced and flickered. "I guess I always figured that drifting was safer," I said. "If you don't have any oars, you can't row. If you can't row, you can't try to get somewhere. And if you don't try to get somewhere, you can't be disappointed when you don't arrive." Drifting felt safer than rowing toward nothing. "And now?" he asked, his eyes still on the little painting. "Now," I said, thinking of his kindness, of the warm cottage, of the yellow moons next to my blue stars. "Now I think maybe there's someone on the shore, waving. Maybe it's worth trying to row." He stared into the flames for a long time. The firelight cast shadows on his face. "I miss her every single day," he said softly, speaking of his wife. "But missing someone is like a garden. You have to tend to it. You have to water it with your memories. But you can't let the weeds take over. You still have to plant new things. You have to let there be life, even after a death." I swallowed hard. The lump in my throat felt tight. "What did you plant?" I asked. "After she was gone, what new thing did you plant in your garden?" "Rosemary," he said without hesitation. "It's a stubborn plant. It's strong, and it smells like memory." We sat there for hours, wrapped in the old quilts, while the storm raged outside and tried to tear the shutters from the house. And as the wind howled, something warm and tight inside me finally began to uncurl. It was a feeling I had not felt in a very long time. It felt like hope. The storm passed. The sun came out, weak and pale. The world outside was wet and clean. The power was still out. The phone lines were down. 2 days later, my landlord from the attic finally got a call through to my cell phone, which I had been charging with a small portable battery pack Arthur owned. His voice was angry. He said the attic had flooded from the storm. The roof was badly damaged. He had already rented it to a new tenant who was willing to pay more and fix the roof himself. I had 5 days to get all of my things out. I felt a wave of panic. 5 days, where would I go? I had nowhere. Over a simple breakfast of oatmeal and toast, I told Arthur what had happened. My voice trembled. He did not look up from his plate. He just calmly buttered a piece of toast, his movements slow and deliberate. "Move in here," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Permanent. You can have the guest room. It can be your room. There will be no rent. Just stay." I stared at him. "That's not how the world works," I said. "People don't just give away rooms for free." "Maybe not," he said, finally looking at me. "Maybe not in the rest of the world. But it's how this house works." That night, I sat on the bed in the guest room. My room. It was hard to believe. All my things from the attic, me few clothes, my box of paints, my sketchbook were now here. Arthur had driven me into town in his old truck to get them. He had carried the heaviest boxes up to the room for me. I felt a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. I took out a piece of paper and a pen. For the first time in 3 years, I wrote a letter to my mother. We had not spoken since a big fight we'd had, but tonight I needed to tell someone. Dear Mom, I'm okay. I wanted you to know that. I'm warm. I have a room in a little white cottage by the sea. The man I live with is an old gardener. He has gentle hands and a quiet voice. He makes soup from scratch. I think I am learning what hope sounds like. It sounds like the sea. It sounds like wind chimes made of shells. I hope you are okay too. Love, M. My name isn't M, it's Clara, but that was my childhood nickname. It felt right. I folded the letter and put it in an envelope. I did not have a stamp, and going to the post office felt like a step I was not ready to take. But just writing the words, just putting them on paper, helped me breathe a little easier. It made it feel real. December arrived. The air grew sharp and cold. Frost painted delicate ferns on the window panes each morning. One afternoon, Arthur brought in a small pine tree from his yard. It was a little crooked, but it smelled wonderful. It scraped the ceiling of the living room. Every house needs a tree for Christmas, he announced. He decided we should make our own ornaments. He mixed flour and salt and water in a big bowl to make salt dough. We sat at the kitchen table for hours like two children. He used a cookie cutter to make perfect stars. My hands were not as steady. I tried to roll out crooked bells and lumpy snowmen. Flour got everywhere. It was on my sweater, in my hair. I looked over at Arthur, and he had a dusting of white flour in his gray, curly hair. He looked younger. He looked soft. Later, we stood side by side at the big kitchen sink, washing the sticky dough from our hands and the cookie cutters. The hot water felt good on my cold fingers. Suds filled the sink. Under the warm, soapy water, our hands brushed against each other. It was a small, accidental touch, but I froze. My heart skipped a beat. He did not pull his hand away. For a second, for 2 heartbeats, the world seemed to stop. The air between us felt thick and shimmery. I could smell the scent of pine from the tree and the soap on our hands. Then the kettle on the stove began to scream. It was ready for our evening tea. The loud whistle broke the spell. We both stepped apart quickly, our faces suddenly shy. That night, I lay in my bed and thought about that moment at the sink. I dreamed of that almost kiss for 3 nights in a row, so... It was Christmas Eve. The night was cold and clear. A huge, bright moon hung in the black sky. After a simple dinner, Arthur asked if I wanted to go for a walk on the beach. He filled a thermos with hot cocoa that he had spiked with a little bit of peppermint schnapps. It was Eleanor's recipe, he said quietly. We walked along the empty beach. The moonlight made the wet sand shine like silver. The waves were gentle, whispering as they rolled onto the shore. We passed pieces of driftwood that, in the dark, looked like strange, sleeping sea animals. About halfway back to the cottage, he stopped walking. "Clara," he said. His voice was serious. I turned to face him. He was holding a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with a simple string. My stomach did a nervous flip. It looked like a ring box. "It's not a ring," he said quickly, as if he could read my mind. "Not yet, anyway." My fingers were trembling as I unwrapped the paper. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a single old-fashioned brass key. A small paper tag was tied to it. On the tag, in his neat handwriting, was one word: home. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, looking not at me, but out at the moonlit ocean. I think that two lonely people might as well keep each other warm. It is a practical arrangement." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes full of a shy hope. "Will you marry me, Clara? Not for grand romance, not for passion, but for company, for hot soup on Tuesdays, for having someone to walk on the beach with, for us." Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring the moon. "That is the least romantic proposal I have ever heard in my entire life," I said, my voice thick with emotion. He smiled, a small, shy smile. "I am 65 years old. I am a practical man. I do practical things." I looked down at the brass key in my hand. It was solid and real. It was a promise of warmth and safety. It was a promise of home. I closed my hand around it. "Yes," I said softly. Then, a little louder, "Yes, I will marry you for soup on Tuesdays." We were married on New Year's Day. The day was pale and bright and cold. We did not go to a church or a courthouse. We got married right there in the cottage living room, standing in front of the wood stove and the crooked Christmas tree. It was just us and one other person. Her name was Marta. She was the town's justice of the peace. She was a kind, round woman who wore too much cinnamon-scented perfume. She cried during the short ceremony. I did not have a fancy white wedding dress. I wore a simple dress I had found at the thrift store in town for $5. It was the color of sea foam. James wore his dark blue pea coat, which I had carefully brushed and pressed for him. We did not make grand promises. We promised to plant rosemary together every spring. We promised to always try to row together, even when the sea was rough. We promised to keep each other warm. Our wedding cake was not big or fancy. Arthur had baked it himself. It was a simple lemon cake. Because life is already tart enough, he said. It needs a little sweetness. As we stood on the porch after Marta had left, tiny, soft snowflakes began to fall from the sky. They looked like confetti. I leaned my head against his shoulder. His coat was rough against my cheek. I used to think love was supposed to be like fireworks, I said quietly. Big, loud, and dramatic. And now? He asked, his arm coming around me to pull me closer. Now I think it's more like bread rising, I said. Quiet, slow, warm, and it fills the whole house. He kissed the top of my head. That's the best kind, he whispered. The winter got deeper and colder, but the cottage was always warm. We left the front door unlocked during the day. Sometimes a neighbor would stop by if they needed to borrow a cup of sugar or a few eggs. Our home became a quiet, warm place for others, too. I painted every morning. I sat at the kitchen table with my watercolors and painted the world outside our clean windows. But now, my paintings were different. I painted landscapes that were bright with impossible blues and hopeful greens. I started a small business. On Saturdays, I would take my paintings to the town market. I set up a small booth with a sign that Arthur had painted for me. It said, Rowboat Studio. Arthur spent his days in the garden, even in the frost. He seemed to be able to talk to the plants, coaxing winter herbs to grow as if they owed him a personal favor. He was getting the soil ready for spring. One afternoon in late winter, I found him in his small greenhouse out back. The air inside was warm and humid and smelled of damp earth. He was carefully transplanting tiny lavender seedlings into small paper cups. He looked up when I came in, his face smudged with dirt. Spring's coming, he said with a smile. I knelt on the dirt floor beside him. So am I said. He raised an eyebrow. Coming to the greenhouse? No, I said, my heart full. I'm coming to life. And I leaned over and kissed him. It was our first proper kiss. It was not like the almost kiss at the sink. This was real and sure. His lips tasted of peppermint and soil. 6 months later, someone else's landlord fixed the leak in the attic above the salty mug. My old life felt like a story about a different person. My collection of rowboat sketches, the ones with no oars and the one with one oar, now hang in a real art gallery in Portland. The show was called Drift and Oar. Every single one of them sold in the first week. Arthur swears it is because in each painting, I secretly hid a tiny painted sprig of rosemary for good luck. We still eat tomato soup on rainy days. It is our tradition. We still play the game with the chalk on the floorboards, finding the quiet places. But now, instead of just stars and moons, we draw little hearts too. I finally bought a stamp and mailed the letter to my mom. A week later, she sent back a postcard. It had a picture of a lighthouse on it. On the back, she had written just 3 words, I am too. We stuck the postcard on the refrigerator with a magnet. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I think of the girl I used to be. The girl who was broke and frozen and so sure that love was a thing that happened to other people. Then I roll over in our warm bed and feel the steady rhythm of Arthur's breathing against my back. And I know, with a certainty that fills my entire soul, that the story of my life got rewritten after all. If you feel like you are drifting in a boat with no oars right now, please just hold on. The shore might be much closer than it looks, and someone, somewhere, might already have a fire lit in the window waiting for you. Share this story with one person you know who needs a reminder that love can be quiet. It can be practical. And it can still be the wildest and most wonderful plot twist of all. And I want you to tell me in the comments, what is the smallest, simplest kindness you have ever received that made a big difference? Let's turn this comment section into a lighthouse for anyone who is still out at sea.